I'm honored to introduce one of the stars of our show, Dr. Seiji Steimetz. As professor, chair of economics, and director of the Office of Economic Research at Cal State Long Beach, Seiji is passionate about sharing his department's economic expertise and data-driven information with the local business community and city leaders. As an economist, he has a talent for translating academic research into real-world applications. Seiji was a first-generation college student educated through the California Community Colleges, Cal State University, and the University of California Systems, a true California success story. In the past 15 years, he's been with Cal State Long Beach. His research specialties include transportation and urban and environmental economics, with an emphasis on applied econometrics and methodology. He is committed to taking what he knows and making it accessible to the community, especially through his role in developing the annual Long Beach Latino Economic Report, and of course, through this Accelerate Long Beach Quarterly Economic Forum. We wouldn't be here today without his vision of bringing the community together to talk about Long Beach's economics. That's why I'm proud to introduce my friend, Dr. Seiji Steimetz.
Thank you, Mark, for that generous introduction. Again, I am Seiji Steimetz with the California State University Long Beach, and it is an absolute pleasure to be here, not just because I'm in this beautiful studio, LBP studio in beautiful downtown Long Beach, but for the first time in a year, I don't have to stand here and give you awful news. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through where we are in this economic recovery, focusing on Long Beach and the surrounding region. So let's start with Los Angeles County, and remember that about 79% of the people who work or who live in Long Beach work somewhere outside of the city and work somewhere in the county. So the county is important to us economically here in Long Beach as well. Also, I'm going to focus on employment data because locally that's the best we can usually do in describing where we are in the recovery. So first, let's look at Los Angeles County jobs. So we've all seen this graph before. On the left, I'm showing you total employment in LA County from before the pandemic, so January 2020 up through our most recent month of data, April. And right before the pandemic, there were about 4.5 million jobs in Los Angeles County. And then when the shutdown, the big shutdown occurred in April, we had this unprecedented, precipitous drop in employment, or as my dear colleague Robert Kleinheads likes to say, we lost the number of jobs that we've gained since 1996 in the county were lost in just a month. Now we could see we've been edging back slowly, and right about here in January, we were at about 4 million jobs. And since January, so looking at how are we starting to recover as things are starting to open up more, as the vaccination rates are starting to climb, employment is up in the county about 3.2% since January. So we're already starting to see good gains. 128,000 jobs have been added. By the way, this little blip here, this drop, that's just a seasonal effect as temporary workers are hired for the holidays and laid off shortly thereafter that. So on balance, we've recovered about 128,000 jobs since the beginning of the year, but employment overall in the county is still down almost 10%. So this is what I'm foreshadowing throughout this talk, cautious optimism. Things are definitely getting better, but we still have a long ways to go. We have 437,000 fewer jobs than before the pandemic, and we still need to pick those up. Now, what specific industries are leading the charge? So looking again at job growth since the beginning of this year, and you've probably heard this in the news, accommodation and food service and arts, entertainment, and recreation. These industries are far and away leading the charge in terms of job recovery. In accommodation and food service, so these are our restaurants and hotels, we've seen 61,000 jobs added in just that sector in LA County just this year. These two sectors together, accommodation and food service and arts, entertainment, and recreation, collectively these are known as the leisure and hospitality industries. So we're seeing big gains there. We're seeing still continued gains in healthcare and specifically more in social assistance. Personal care and other services. So these are our laundry services. These are the hair salons, the nail salons. They're starting to recover at a more brisk pace this year than, say, before, in December when the status of the pandemic was still unclear. Also, information is showing gains. That's where our motion picture and sound recording industries are, and those are especially important in Los Angeles County. Now, sort of the theme here, though, is that it's the hardest hit industries that are leading the charge. So since, again, the beginning of January, we've seen 22% gains in accommodation and food service, 27% in arts, entertainment, and recreation, personal care and information, strong gains. So while we should be happy that these hardest hit industries are bouncing back, we should also understand that you get large percentage increases when you start with a smaller number. So part of why we see these industries coming back so quickly is because they were hit so hard at the beginning of the pandemic and throughout. Now, we could look at some specific sub-industries or specific types of businesses within these industries, because I know the words accommodation and food service aren't exactly exciting to hear. So, for example, if we talk about full-service restaurants, sit-down restaurants, we've seen 50% employment growth just this year in full-service restaurants. Accommodation also is showing very strong growth in employment. Limited service restaurants, not so much, because we relied pretty heavily on these takeout places, fast food places anyways, during the quarantine. Arts, entertainment, and recreation, we see leading that sector is amusement, gambling, and recreation. They want to get back to their entertainment and their gambling, 59% increase there. Performing arts and spectator sports are starting to edge back as things cautiously start to reopen. Same thing with museums and historical sites, not opening as quickly, but starting to head back. Again, we mentioned personal and laundry services, large gains, 18% employment growth in that area. And religious and civic organizations are starting to trail back as we start to reopen. Healthcare mostly recovered by the end of last year, so we're seeing kind of flat or modest gains in healthcare. Social assistance, in particular child care. All right, child daycare services is seeing a large growth in employment as things start to open up, and that's especially important in getting part of our labor pool back. Information, I mentioned motion picture and sound recording, again 9% growth in that sector, which is very strong for just the last few months. Dr. Klein-Enns mentioned that transportation and warehousing has been more or less booming, especially as we've been relying on online purchasing and alternatives to face-to-face interaction with our community. So we're not going to see very big gains in that sector because they've mostly recovered. Notably is an increase, though, in transit and ground passenger transportation. So people who were taking buses and public transportation before are starting to get back onto those buses. Now look in red here, we have couriers and messengers. Now if you attended the last Accelerate Long Beach event and listened to my talk, you probably heard me say that there was about a 30% increase in employment in couriers and messengers compared to before the pandemic. And that's because during the quarantine, of course, we were relying heavily on our Instacart drivers and Grubhub drivers. Like lots of food delivery services were keeping us fed and as we were sheltering in place. Now we're starting to see the pendulum swing back a little bit. So there's drop-offs now in employment as we can now start substituting back into, for example, for full-service restaurants. In retail trade, kind of flat right now across the board. Notice that general merchandise and supercenters, so these are our large discount warehouse clubs, they're starting to see considerable declines in employment, partly for that same effect that I'm talking about, partly for the same reasons that we're seeing declines in employment in couriers and messengers. We are transitioning back from, when we were in lockdown, we had to find other ways to take care of ourselves. And now that we're opening up, you see the pendulum swinging back a little bit. So where are we overall in this recovery? So let's look at let's compare to January of 2020. So what is the employment level now compared to just before the pandemic? And if we look at this chart here, we have arts, entertainment, and recreation, and accommodation and food services. The employment levels are still 28 and 25% lower than they were before the pandemic. So although these leisure and hospitality industries are indeed leading the charge back to recovery, they are still the hardest hit. Employment is still, in those two industries, is still depressed below pre-pandemic levels or any other of these major industries. Same thing with personal care and other services, state government education, including where I work, information sector with motion picture and sound recording. Right? These sectors are still gradually and perhaps struggling a little bit to recover. So things are getting better, but we're pretty far from fully recovered. Except for maybe in some of these industries we see down here at the bottom. So finance and insurance, construction, healthcare. I would say that these industries are mostly recovered in terms of employment. Now, one thing we can't overlook, and I know I harp on this every single time, but we just can't look, we have to consider that there is a disparate recovery trajectory for many different people in our community. And in particular, if we look at job growth or employment levels compared to pre-pandemic levels, if we parse that out by income group, we're going to see a much different effect or a much different recovery trajectory for these different income groups. So for example, if we look at this green line right here, that's showing the employment trajectory compared to January of 2020, right? So compared to just before the pandemic, that's showing the employment level up until the end of last month, or the beginning of last month. We see that for earners earning more than $60,000 a year, employment is actually up. So there's a 1.4% increase in employment in LA County compared to before the pandemic. For middle, I shouldn't call them middle, for those earning between $37,000 and $60,000 a year, employment is down a little bit compared to before the pandemic, but mostly recovered. And in each case, you see for these two income groups, for people earning more than $37,000 a year, we've seen some bumpy road, but mostly an upward trajectory. Now let's compare that to the red line. The red line is earners who make less than $37,000 a year. Now, $37,000 a year is the median wage rate in Los Angeles County. So we're talking about half of the working population in Los Angeles County is following this red trajectory. We all know from before, and especially if you've seen Dr. Kleinhans and I talk before over the last year and a half, it's the low-income earners that got hit the hardest and have been struggling the most to recover. But if we pick, say, we're in June now, let's pick June of last year. This is the employment level compared to January of last year. The employment level has not really climbed. Again, so job growth is definitely there in Los Angeles County, but for the lower half of the earning distribution, the job growth hasn't really appreciated much since just this last year. I mean, since June of last year. So this is another example of what we've been citing before as a K-shaped recovery, a lopsided recovery. We're doing well overall, but we still have to keep an eye on what's happening with those who are in the lower income categories who appear to be struggling to get back to work. So how does that translate to the Long Beach situation specifically? Well, again, we know that unemployment in Long Beach back during the pandemic, we were at low unemployment, 5% and even a little bit more lower before that. So we had historically low unemployment rates in Long Beach back at the beginning of 2020, and that jumped very quickly to historically high unemployment. And this is our trajectory back towards where we are now at 11.5%. So just to give you some context, back before the pandemic started, there were 12,000 Long Beach residents who were out of work. Right now, there are about 27,000 Long Beach residents who are out of work. So things are definitely better, but still we have more than double the what we would call good times amount of people out of work. Now, unemployment is measured as how many people, what percentage of people who are looking for work do not have a job. The people who are looking for work, that number is called the labor force. And so we might be concerned, the labor force has been jumping around too. We see that there were dips in labor force participation and then, a steady rise back. So we want to be careful when we cite unemployment rates that we also keep a measure on what's happening in the labor pool so that we're not just picking up effects of people maybe leaving the labor pool. And people leaving the labor pool with the same number of people employed would actually reduce your unemployment. So looking at this though, we see that Long Beach has nearly recovered its labor force. Long Beach labor force right now is about 239,000 compared to about 243,000 just before the pandemic. So the labor force is back, they're ready to work. Now it's just a matter of getting the rest of those in the labor force back to work. So how does our unemployment rate of 11.5% in Long Beach compare to the rest of the region? And in California, of course, it's higher. It's consistent with unemployment rates in Los Angeles County, but slightly higher than in Orange County, San Bernardino County, and so forth. San Bernardino and Riverside, for example, a big part of their economy is transportation and warehousing and supply chain logistics industries. And as Dr. Kleinhans mentioned, those industries did quite well weathering the pandemic, and we're seeing that reflected in their relatively low unemployment rates. And we could talk a little bit later about why Los Angeles County and Long Beach in particular has a higher unemployment rate than some of the surrounding cities in the region. But if you look at this heat map I've created here, a darker area, right, you're comparing colors here. A darker area means higher unemployment rate than in Long Beach. So if you look at the composition of LA County, right, LA County is a very socioeconomically diverse region. And we are home to some among Southern California's lower income residents too, which also would then explain on balance why we might have a lower unemployment rate. Excuse me, a higher unemployment rate. Now, what I like to use, considering how little data we're going to have on things like gross regional product and output at the local level, what I like to do as my bellwether is look at unemployment insurance claims, right? If people are filing unemployment insurance claims now, and by that I mean initial uninsurance employment claims, right? That means that if we have a high initial unemployment claims rate right now, that means we're going to have higher unemployment in the future. Again, looking at this trajectory, we had a staggering number of claims per week in initial unemployment claims throughout the beginning of the pandemic, and that's tapered off. But right now, we're at about 3 times normal the weekly claims rate for unemployment. So again, that's 3 times is a lot, but much better than where we were before. During the peak of the pandemic, the claims rate was 31 times normal. Now we're at about 3 times normal, with the most recent month giving us about 5,700 new claims in the city. Now, let's keep in mind while we're talking about disparate recovery paths, looking at these unemployment insurance claims data, throughout the pandemic, women in the labor force have suffered a disproportionately high burden of this pandemic. This red line is the unemployment claims rate for females. The blue line is the unemployment claims rate for males. Right now even, the female claims rate is 3.7 times normal for females, whereas for males it's about 2.9 times normal. So we're seeing that females are bearing the brunt, or have been bearing more of the brunt of the unemployment, and perhaps we could talk about that when we sit down with the publisher of the Long Beach Post and Long Beach Business Journal, David Summers. Looking forward to chatting with him. Maybe we could explore that a little bit. So where are we again now? If we look at in our most recent month of data in May, in which industry, looking by industry, what are the claims rates now compared to before the pandemic? That is, we'll call the pre-pandemic level unemployment claims rate, let's call that normal. Right now in arts, entertainment, and recreation, personal care and other services, accommodation and food services, right, those claims rates are still 6 to 12 times higher than normal. So again, these leisure and hospitality, personal care, other services, these face-to-face industries are indeed leading the recovery, but they're also still the ones that are struggling the most to come back. In fact, one thing we really, looking at other dimensions of this lopsided recovery, let's look at, for example, arts, entertainment, and recreation, and personal care and other services, the top 2 in terms of unemployment claims rates right now, relative to their normal rates. These unemployment claims are unique in the sense that they include pandemic unemployment assistance, right? So these are small business owners and the self-employed who previously wouldn't have qualified for unemployment benefits, but through CARES and other coronavirus relief efforts now qualify. And so what we're starting to see in these numbers too is that the high claims rates in these 2 industries are also partly reflecting the fact that there are large numbers of business owners, small business owners in these categories. For example, in Long Beach, 21% of all of the arts and entertainment and recreation businesses are self-employed, or these workers are self-employed. 26% of all personal care and other services workers are self-employed. And we're starting to get a sense then that as things recover, small businesses are having a little bit harder time. And one way to capture that, looking back at county data for a second, if we look at this green line, again, we're going to compare to normal. We're going to compare what is consumer spending and what is small business revenue compared to back in January of last year. And we see that consumer spending is up. Right now, consumer spending in the county is up about 8%. But small businesses are having trouble recovering that growth. Small business revenue is down, about 30% since the beginning of January, or since the beginning of 2020. So we've seen steady increases in consumer spending, but pretty flat small business revenue. In fact, again, down by 30% right now. And that's especially important to Long Beach because Long Beach, the backbone of Long Beach's economy is small businesses. I know we have some awesome marquee large employers that employ a lot of people, but if you look at the number of establishments in Long Beach, which is about 18,000, 97% of them have fewer than 50 employees. In fact, 88%, almost 90% have fewer than 10 employees. It's clear that really the lion's share of establishments, of businesses in Long Beach are small businesses. And we have to keep an eye on them as, again, we're seeing that small businesses are recovering a little more slowly than the rest of the economy. So, where do we go from here? How do we go onward and upward? First, of course, until hopefully the next time we speak to you, right now we're still focused on recovery. Right, the regional economy is definitely improving. Unemployment rates are falling. The labor force in Long Beach is nearly back to its pre-pandemic level. And as vaccination rates climb, jobs are returning, especially to those hardest hit industries. But again, cautious optimism is warranted. Employment is still below pre-pandemic levels in every major sector. And the economic recovery is still lopsided. Employment is still lower among lower income workers compared to the beginning of last year. In fact, in this last year, since June of 2020, there hasn't really been an increase in employment for those making $37,000 a year or less in Los Angeles County. And again, that's the median income. So we're talking about half of our income distribution hasn't really seen an appreciable gain in employment in the last year. Also, small businesses are struggling to recover despite gains in consumer spending. Once we recover, once we can start returning back to what we would normally worry about is economic growth, we can start talking about what are the things that are promising for growth. Now, economic growth, if you've heard me say this before, I'm sounding like a broken record. Economic growth is accelerated by expanding our traded industries. And by that, when we produce things here in Long Beach and we sell them to the rest of the world, when we sell goods and services to the rest of the world, that's how we improve our economic growth and economic prosperity. Right? We can't get rich selling things to ourselves. We have to sell things to other parts of the world. Now, one really promising example of opportunities for economic growth is this new space innovation ecosystem we have in Long Beach. Or I shouldn't say new, I should say re-emerging space innovation ecosystem, which is known lovingly as Space Beach. Right? Space Beach is a promising example of bolstering Long Beach's traded cluster of industries. Aerospace innovators that are recently headquartered in Long Beach include Virgin Orbit, Rocket Lab, Relatively Space, Spin Launch, and even more recently, Morph 3D. Right, we're starting to see a lot of marquee, right, really big players in the space industry agglomerate around our city. And this is fancy secret data. We could look, for example, at the trajectory of Long Beach aerospace employment in our city. People are under the impression that Long Beach aerospace kind of disappeared for a while after the C-17 project left. And that's just not the case. There was a decline. So compared to, say, back in 2008, yes, we've seen a decline in overall employment in aerospace, but very recently, in fact, in just the last 3 years, we've seen a 48% increase in employment in our aerospace sector. And that's just looking at this narrow cluster of aerospace industries. So I'm in that narrow cluster, there's over 4,000 jobs in Long Beach just in aerospace. And some people I trust and admire a great deal over at the Pacific Gateway Innovation Workforce Innovation Network, they estimate that if you include parts of the supply chain in aerospace that we have around 6,500 jobs right now in aerospace. In fact, if we look at, in the green line, we have the total share of payroll in aerospace. That is, aerospace's total payments to employees compared to all of Long Beach. And down here in the blue line, we have total employment compared to all of Long Beach. We see that even right now, right, aerospace's share of employment in Long Beach is 2.7%. Well, that's about the same as our total employment in food and beverage stores. Our total payroll of 5.2% share in aerospace, that's about the same share of payroll as like restaurants and bars. So aerospace in Long Beach never disappeared. It declined, but it's still strong and bouncing back according to these data. And of course, let's not forget that aerospace is enjoying proximity to one of the nation's premier producers of engineers. The California State University Long Beach has increased its production of engineers by 140% over the last year, and it's consistently among the nation's top 40 in the nation in producing engineering degrees. We're also close to other schools that produce a lot of engineers. UC Irvine ranks in the top 10 traditionally, and UCLA ranks in the top 50. Those are okay schools too. So, Space Beach, that's kind of our focus of today, and definitely a worthy focus because that's a promising aspect of our possible future growth in a traded sector. Right? Long Beach's aerospace industry never disappeared. It's always had a relatively large share of employment and payroll in the city. And Long Beach checks all of the boxes for a thriving space innovation ecosystem. We got a skilled workforce, right? We have an established supply chain in aerospace and those related industries. Got a lot of real estate around the airport too. We have lots of available real estate for R&D and manufacturing. Proximity, of course, to amazing universities like Cal State Long Beach and others. And let's not forget a diverse and dynamic urban setting in which to live and work. So, and keep in mind too that a thriving space beach, a thriving traded industry will uplift our local businesses by generating more customers for them. I will leave it at that. So thank you for listening. Go Long Beach, go Space Beach, and go Beach. And we will be right back.